See, is that better? You can hear me now? All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the February 20th, 2025 CARTA Board meeting. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Director Desmond, if you lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, so it says here in the notes to make sure that we announce that we now have a new ex officio member who was recently appointed to the board by the Sacramento Transportation Authority, Vice Mayor Karina Talamontes from the city of West Sacramento. I'm sorry, the city of Sacramento.
You were close. You were close.
I'll let you know.
But- That's awesome. I'm not sure how that happened, but it did. So welcome Karina Talamontes to joining us this afternoon to the CARTA board. So if I'll ask the clerk to please take roll.
All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your presence. Director Aceves. Absent. Chapman.
Here.
Desmond.
Here.
Early.
Here.
Villegas.
Here.
Ex officio members Click.
Here.
Deloria. Talamontes. We have a quorum.
All right, very good. All right, moving on to public communications. This is the opportunity for anybody who is here interested in speaking to the body without item on the agenda, anything that's not on the agenda, but within the subject matter and jurisdiction of this commission. So anybody here to speak on items not on the agenda?
There's no public comment.
Very good. So that takes us then to housekeeping items. It's an opportunity for any director to disclose any conflicts of interest or any items on today's agenda. Seeing none, then that will take us to our consent agenda calendar. We have one item, and that's the minutes from the December 19th, 2024 board meeting. Looking for a motion.
Move consent.
Early seconds.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Takes care of consent, and that's the minutes from December of 2024. Let's see. So we're now here for our first action item. It's agenda item 2. It's election of chair and vice chair. So Kathleen, is that going to be?
I'll open it up briefly for you all. So staff is requesting that the board elect a chair and vice chair. Staff is requesting that it be a 2-year term. So for 2025 and 2026 to align with the next election cycle. Previously, Chair Oscar Villegas and Vice Chair Dante Early have served for 2024. The CARTA JPA agreement doesn't set any precedent on rotation or which of the voting members can serve in chair and vice chair, and we're new, so we have no tradition. So totally up to you all on how you want to handle it. Happy to take any questions.
Very good. So we'll build the plane as we get it off the ground. So.
I'd like to put a motion forward to have Villegas stay as our chair and would also nominate myself. I know that's not normal, but I'm that person to nominate myself as vice chair.
Right. We have a motion on the table. Any other motions?
I'll second that motion.
We're looking for a second. So we have a second. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor of nominating as said, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Rich, you're thinking about it?
I guess all right.
All right, fair enough. Very good. So that'll be the order. Thank you very much for your confidence in us to continue to lead it forward for the next couple of years, at least. Moving on to agenda item number 3, and that's the 2025 CARTA meeting schedule. Kathleen, that's yours as well.
Yes, thank you, Chair Villegas, and congratulations on your reelection. So we teased this a little bit at the December meeting. So originally when CARTA adopted its 2025 board schedule back at its October meeting, we went with a bi-monthly schedule. Based on what we see for the heavy workload for 2025, we want to increase that frequency to monthly. So the item before you is to adopt a new schedule for 2025 that has monthly meetings. Of course, I'll do my best to cancel them whenever we don't have a sufficient agenda to make that happen, but really just want to make sure you all don't feel rushed as we're working through some heavy policy decisions in 2025. So staff recommend approval of the schedule and the attached resolution, which we'll file with the state for the official CARTA board schedule. Happy to take any questions.
Right. So before we take any public comment, if there is any, are there any questions by any of the board members? Pretty straightforward. I think staff has indicated pretty regularly that the schedule is going to be aggressive, or at least starting to get aggressive. There's a lot of big ticket items we'll need to take up this year. And so I think the schedule reflects that. So,
Comment?
yes, ma'am.
So I will just say, noting the monthly meetings, it is, I think, needed. We need to really come up with a plan around our budget. We need to hire an executive director. And so there is going to be a lot of work ahead of us. I'm looking forward to really laying a strong foundation for CARTA. And so am happy that we'll be picking our meetings up.
Yeah, and on that note, before we take any public comment, welcome. The work is gonna move very quickly, and so I know staff, I mean, it's not ideal, but it is what it is. We've moved heaven and earth to get to this point. Staff's on a pretty tight time frame. And so I would just offer, in the event that you're interested in maybe checking in with staff, or staff maybe reaching out to board members just periodically, just to make sure that things are still progressing. Many of us have multiple roles that we play, and when we show up at these meetings, oftentimes it's coming from 800 other meetings, and we're forced to make significant decisions with a very little lead up time. So I just offer that as a precautionary measure. All right, so this is informational only. Clerk, is there anybody that's signed up to speak on this item?
This is actually an action item, and there's no public comment for it.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is action. Very good. And there is no public comment. All right. So with that, if there are any other comments or questions by members of the board? Seeing none, we then have a schedule to consider. We're on item 3. Yep. We need a motion to move forward with the schedule.
Early moves.
Second. All right, early moves, chapter second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Hearing none, that item moves forward as well. Thank you very much. That's all right. Let's see. That takes us then to item 4 is staffing approach and fiscal year 25-26 operations funding. Kathleen, that's yours as well.
Thank you so much. So in this item, which is an action item before you, staff is recommending that the board approve an overall staffing structure and a general direction for us to head into staff CARTA over the next couple of years as it prepares for opening for toll revenue collection in 2028. So for the agenda for my presentation today for this item, I'm going to recap some of the December discussion, including a bit more of a deep dive for Director Talamontes, who we're welcoming to the CARTA board this meeting, and recap what I heard from you all and how that's informed what we've developed for the staff recommended approach, and have some discussion on what that structure is and a bit on the transition timing as we move from what we have now with SACOG staff to what CARTA will ultimately need in the future. We've also tied in, since of course staffing and funding for the staffing go hand in hand, a discussion on what to do in the immediate term for fiscal year 25-26, and a bit of a tee up for some more conversations we're going to have over the next few meetings on what to do for kind of the midterm funding picture for CARTA. As a reminder, right now CARTA has sort of 3 types of work that are happening behind the scenes to prepare for these meetings. So on the first bucket, we have here CARTA administration. This is the day-to-day staffing work of CARTA, writing the staff reports, putting together the items, convening all the other parties, clerking, finances, all that good stuff, all of which is being performed by SACOG staff on a cost reimbursement basis to CARTA. Then we also have voting members for CARTA. So currently that's SACOG, YOLO TD, and Caltrans. Those entities have voting members on the board and can sort of exert their influence through the board member votes as we bring items before the CARTA board. There's also the larger technical advisory group, which includes the other agencies who don't yet have toll facilities coming online and aren't yet voting members of CARTA, but may someday become voting members of CARTA, so that we make sure that whatever policies and decisions CARTA makes have in mind the ultimate long-range picture and the larger vision for the toll network throughout the greater Sacramento region. So what we want to make really clear is that what SACOG is not saying that it wants to move away from CARTA at all. It intends to remain an active voting member, an active member of the CARTA tag, but looking ahead at the work that CARTA needs to undertake, particularly supporting the construction of YOLO 80, bringing toll systems online, building back offices, all of that kind of capital operations work isn't what SACOG does, right? We're your policy and planning folk. And so we are not best suited to continue to fully administer CARTA in the near term. So this was sort of the key kind of call to question that I brought back in December to the CARTA board, and we had some discussion on what we should do instead. So what I heard in December is that an executive director is really important to this body and that this is really a critical time for CARTA to have steady leadership. There was also a bit of a kind of penny wise, pound foolish conversation on it being worth it to pay for an executive director to kind of make sure that we're getting CARTA right with the sort of central hard policy issues that tolling deals with. There was also some discussion that operation costs that are incurred have a long tail, right? They're typically debt that CARTA has to pay back with its toll revenues. So we still want to be conservative where we can. So not overly conservative that we're shooting ourselves in the foot, but not, of course, being wasteful of taxpayer dollars. And then some discussion that while the tags executive directors, those are the executive directors of the member agencies. So Placer County Transportation Planning Agency, El Dorado County Transportation Commission, Sacramento Transportation Authority, Yolo Transportation District, and Caltrans District 3, there it is, are great and do great work. They're not really able to serve as the executive director of CARTA, right? So we really do have a gap is what I heard back in December. So what I've done with what I heard is put together a staffing structure that we're recommending for approval. So I'm going to walk you through this slightly complicated graphic here, right? So if we start on the left side with the green boxes, you have what I would categorize as like general areas of work that need to be done to administer CARTA. The sort of executive direction, this is, you know, who has the final say on policy directions, who signs your contracts, who has the fiscal responsibility for the entity, who, when the SACB calls, answers, that kind of executive piece that CARTA needs. Then there's the toll program management. This is where you need the toll expertise, right? The folks who can actually lead the day-to-day work, the project management of the various pieces that CARTA needs to put together. We also have finance and administration, procurement, processing invoices, developing budgets, keeping track of how finances are going, all of those really important, but nuts and bolts pieces. And then last, we have miscellaneous support services. So this is anything else that CARTA could need that's not related to toll program. So really just identifying that there's a bit of an unknown in the future here. And so we're trying to build a staffing structure that provides some flexibility so that CARTA can tap additional resources if it ends up needing them. So what I'm showing here across those 4 buckets is how we see this transitioning over time between now and 2025 with how this is currently staffed, and 2028 when we anticipate that we'll first start collecting revenues on YOLO 80. So moving left to right now you have SACOG staff and HNTB sharing the executive and toll program parts, the transportation part of what we do at CARTA. And then you have SACOG staff doing finance administration, and we use sort of temporary contracts or piggyback on SACOG's contracts if we needed it for those pieces that don't fall into tolling. As we move, we have an executive director starting in sometime in 2026, between 2026 and 2027, depending on needs and how funding comes together. It takes a long time to recruit an executive director and bring them on board. So really just trying to be realistic about when I think that could possibly happen, moving as quickly as possible. And so what staff is proposing is that in the interim, we have the tolling consultant contract absorb a lot of that work that SACOG is doing on executive direction and toll program management. So have a meatier, more expensive contract in that interim period. And then once the executive director comes on board, you still need your tolling consultant contract, but you can offload a bit of that work, right? This is one of the advantages of having a heavy contract model, is that you can kind of ebb and flow how much consulting services you have depending on what your real needs are. And we can make that box as big or as small as we need it to be depending on how executive director recruitment goes. On the finance and administration side, SACOG staff have offered to continue to clerk and do finance to provide that sort of steady piece through CARTA through 2027 when the executive director comes on board. And then at that point, really the executive director should reevaluate what CARTA's needs are and what makes more sense. So it's not to say it necessarily has to end there, right? But we sort of need to have a new conversation as a region on what we want to do with those pieces. And then creating some new on-call contracts for CARTA that will give it the flexibility it needs if it needs sort of specialized consulting services that aren't involved in toll consulting services. So this is kind of the overall vision of how these pieces will come together. And then I'm going to walk you through a bit on what this transition timing looks like. Moving as quickly as we can, right? Because if you start on the bottom here, SACOG's planning staff are going to continue in their current capacity through about December. I think there might be a little bleed over into January, which you can see with that blue bar here as I built out this schedule. But really trying to make sure that SACOG staff are setting up CARTA to be successful in 2026 and have all the pieces in place to be able to exercise those contracts. So while the action before you today is to approve this overall direction, we're going to be coming back with the subsequent actions to implement it, right? To say, this is the scope for the tolling consultant contract, this is the amount, provide feedback on those pieces. And so this is how I see those dominoes falling over the course of this year. Looking at trying to take board action to release those RFPs around the June timeframe so we can have our tolling and on-call RFPs out in the summer, do consultant selection and negotiation through the fall so that we can provide that notice to proceed in January with a little transition time from SACOG staff to make sure that we get the consultant team properly up to speed. And then I have also bringing on an executive director recruiter at the end of the calendar year so that as CARTA looks to recruit an executive director, it has those resources to be able to do that in early 2026. I have proposed initiate executive director recruitment in February, March. That's really dependent on, of course, what the board wants, funding, a lot of other pieces. I think that's the earliest we could possibly initiate executive director recruitment from my estimation. All this is, of course, dependent on funding. So I wanted to give you a picture of the 2025-2026 funding piece. You're going to have a draft and final budget here before you later on this spring, but wanted to give you the confidence that we've already looked into some of these numbers. We see a path forward to provide this funding for the staffing action we're asking you to approve today. At the base level, so sort of for the administration, tolling consultant pieces, executive direction, those sort of core functions that you saw in the 4 green boxes, we think that's about $1.4, $1.5 million for next fiscal year. On top of that, as you may recall, CARTA pursued a grant with Caltrans to go after to produce an equity study. If we win that grant, it has a $208,000 match spread across a couple of years, so I incorporated that. We're also going to be pursuing roadside and back office agreements. So I think there'll be additional technical services and legal service expenses next year that aren't sort of in the base. So, overall looking at a $1.6, $1.7 million budget, roughly speaking, for next fiscal year. Anticipate there'll be about a $600,000 carryover from the initial SACOG loan. So you're looking at a remaining need of about $1.1 million. And so the staff recommendation, I have this slide that dives into a bit of a detail on where those numbers came from. So I'm happy to walk through this on question if you guys are really interested in these pieces, but it's mostly just to show my homework a little bit here on where the number came from for the base estimate. But really want to move towards understanding what the longer term picture is for operations funding, right? So in this initial next year for fiscal year 25-26, the staff recommendation also requests that staff are directed to pursue another SACOG loan, which SACOG staff have indicated is possible for us, but we'll have to go through the SACOG board process. But that's going to be the last one that SACOG is likely able to give. So CARTA needs to identify additional operations funding options. We've kicked around some things as agency partners, and I categorize them into kind of 2 buckets. Technically feasible on paper, but probably unlikely, right? So those are private sector loans. CARTA has no credit rating. We haven't built anything before. So a bank really coming and lending us is very, very unlikely. Addition is sort of a grant or a loan through the governor's budget or CalSTA. This is something we were kicking around before the LA fires, which we know will be really a big part of what the administration is considering, particularly on the transportation side. So again, technically feasible, but I think unlikely. So really what's technically feasible and more likely, although there's no like golden amazing options on this slide, is looking at a loan from a member agency's operating reserve, right? Which is what SACOG has done for CARTA. Additionally, we could look at some fund swaps with capital dollars, which tend to be a bit more available in the region, to try to identify if we could have some more flexible funding come back through CARTA. So these are all options that we're pursuing and trying to work with agency staff to bring together. So before you, the staff recommendation is to approve the staffing approach, which is a new tolling consultant starting in January of 2026, executive director recruitment consulting coming online before January 2026, so that you can recruit an executive director sometime in 2026, and then directing staff to pursue that additional loan from SACOG for between $1 and $1.3 million to cover next year's operating costs. And then also directing staff to develop a report on options to fund CARTA's operations through fiscal year 27-28. Right, so we've brought before you some information on this, but we really need to dig into it a bit more with the partners and bring back what are the true options, the pros and cons of the true options at a future meeting. So looking to get that direction to put that in stone to get that work done. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Right. Are there any initial
Mr. Chair.
questions? Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one point to kind of underscore Kathleen's presentation. So on this last bullet here, right, the idea to develop this report on funding scenarios, right? You heard about the desire that we've heard on hiring an executive director. And while it's true that another loan from SACOG would cover the operating costs, we also have to go start recruiting in this fiscal year. And so if we don't have funds identified, it's going to make it really increasingly challenging for us to go out on the market and say, we can confidently offer a job to someone for the following fiscal year if we don't have those funds. So that last item really is a near-term option. So I just want to underscore that, even though it says fiscal years 27-28 on there.
Got it. That's really helpful. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, not only nonprofits that are just getting started, they'll hire the executive director and their first responsibility is go out and raise money to pay for their salary to keep the job. So understood. Okay, well, that's really helpful. Are there any initial questions by members of the board?
I'll wait till after public comment.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and see whether or not there's any public comment. I don't have any slips.
There's no public comment on this
There is no
item.
public comment. All right, so back to us for comments or questions.
Chair, I have a question. And so I think, Eric, you might have answered this indirectly, but I do want to make sure I'm fully clear. Because I see initiate executive director recruitment of, it looks like maybe between February and March of 2026. And I have to admit, I had the question as well. When we are doing our RFP, why we wouldn't release all of these at the same time, just what the thought was behind it, and in the actual sequence of events. And I will get even more specific. It was the thought the RFP would inform the ED. I think, Eric, maybe what you were touching on was the funding model would inform the executive director, at least the salary. So just one, because it feels like recruiting February, March of 2026, depending on how long that will take. To your point, I think when you said we would like to have someone on by 2027, it would be great to actually start recruitment in 2025.
Yeah, I think Kathleen can speak to the RFP for the technical consultants, and then maybe we separate out the executive director recruitment because that's an RFP and contract, right? But maybe you want to start.
I was just trying to figure out why we couldn't release the RFP, also hire a recruiter to then start to recruit for the executive director in 2025. And I didn't know if maybe the technical contract was informing that hiring and that was the sequence of events, because both cost money.
Yeah, we could hire the executive recruiter at any point, right? So there's two pieces that went into sort of the rolling part. One is that I do a lot of the staff work. I also work at SACOG, so trying to spread some of that work over responsibly a period of time where we can. And the other piece is that there's a lot of work happening on developing toll policy, getting a more accurate traffic and revenue study that I think will inform some of these pieces where we understand really what CARTA is looking at in the future. And so we could bring on the executive director recruiter sooner, but some of those pieces need to come in the fall before we really think about bringing on the executive director. And so bringing the toll consultant on earlier is to close that gap, right? To make sure that there's no gap in service for CARTA when SACOG closes out its work in its current form in December, and when the executive director is able to come on board, the tolling consultant needs to be there to close that gap.
So is the thought, and I appreciate it, it sounds like it's more staff capacity rather than necessarily that we couldn't bring on a recruiter to start to recruit the executive director, because ideally the exec director is also a part of the getting a better sense of the tolling data, the traffic studies, all of the things that would be needed to set the foundation for CARTA. At least in my mind.
Yes,
but-
ideally, I think, but what Eric is saying about us needing to be able to identify multiple years of funding to recruit an executive director for multiple years is also driving that delay, right? And so what we're trying to do with this staffing structure is making sure that the essential pieces that you all need as a board to make good decisions, and also Caltrans needs to continue construction on YOLO 80 on its specific timeline, which is underway, are happening behind the scenes, managing that risk a little bit with with the executive director.
And then just my last question on, and I know it's going to be on us to figure out the potential funding and streams and where those might come from. I'm looking on here and it would be helpful just for you to call it out because I think you already did. When ideally would we have that complete on this timeline?
Identified the multiple years of funding.
Yeah.
In order to release an RFP in this summer, we should release a multi-year RFP, right? And we're gonna have a more detailed discussion on this as we work to develop that scope. But we are looking at the tolling consultant serving from 2026 to 2028. That's a big contract, so that needs to be a funded contract. So to answer your question, I think like summer is really when we need to know where this money is coming from, ideally.
So questions beget more questions. And so then it's the same place I started then. If we've identified the funding streams for the large contract of the RFP, it seems to me we would have also identified the funding stream for the executive director, which will be also a multi-year contract. Just calling it out.
We could certainly, I think, what I think I'm hearing is that we'd like to move the executive director up.
You're just hearing that from me.
Okay, but yes, from you, what I'm hearing is we'd like to move the executive director up, which fully heard, and I think the finances falling into place is possible. So we can explore moving that up as we can. We're not trying to delay it unnecessarily. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just trying to understand just the timeline. And it seems to me that we're gonna have to, regardless of hiring executive director in February of 2026 or the recruiter in February of 2026 versus earlier, we're gonna have to figure out the funding stream in order to fund any of this work. And so that's not necessarily the blocker for the recruitment for the executive director. The blocker could be, and that answer is fine, by the way, like, hey, we just don't have the time. We're already doing you a solid doing this. That's acknowledged as well. And so I was just trying to understand the actual reasons for the timeline.
Director Early, if I can try to add into here, we had a very good conversation at a staff level recently. And just to add on what Kathleen said, what I brought away from that staff conversation, which anybody here is also welcome to chime in on, is this market is a pretty competitive market. The people who are potential candidates to step in and have the expertise that you all want so we can actually deliver these projects, they could look a lot of places and get hired a lot of places. So as Kathleen said, it's going to be very difficult for us to say we've got about half a year of funding for you, but like good luck, because we probably won't recruit those people and that kind of talent. So I think in part we're giving ourselves a little bit of time because the amount of money that CARTA will need in the sort of the 2 to 3 year multi-cycle, in addition to be able to pay an executive director, but actually do the functions, we think it's going to take a little bit of time to go out and figure out exactly how we're going to get those kinds of probably loans in order to be able to do that. So I think that was partly in our thinking, is to give us a bit of runway, but not too much runway. If I would just say, if I'm thinking about this correctly, if we are incredibly successful and we figured out a funding package, I think we can absolutely come back to the CARTA board and say, guess what? We were so successful in our, trying to figure out where loans might come from that we can actually accelerate this process. But I think we're just trying to give ourselves some reasonable expectations.
Great, thank you.
Director Chapman.
Thank you, Chair Villegas. Question kind of following up on that. Were there conversations or are there kind of pros and cons to having that delayed? So bringing in a new executive director once some of these big decisions have already been made by this board and having that executive director coming into those decisions that have already been made, are there kind of cons to that? Like, do you see that being an executive director coming in and working with this board, going through some of this, the decision-making process that we're going to be going through, and then them working with us on that as a partner, right, as executive director, or them coming into these really big, heavy, meaty decisions that we've already made, and then they are dealing with it on the back end?
I think I would caution us to think too much about what the ideal situation was. We haven't been in the ideal situation for YOLO 80 at really any point here, right? And so, yes, I think abstractly, starting with an executive director and having them there every step of the way on toll policy, formation, all of those pieces would be great. But there are other things that are dependent in the chain. So roadside needs to come on board while Caltrans is under construction, which by the way, they're putting shovels in the ground in April. So we have like 2.5 summers to get a roadside system underway. In order to have a roadside, we have to have a back office. In order to have a back office, we have to have policy. So it's like we've worked our way back where we can't wait on some of these things. And I'd also argue that empathetically to this future executive director, right, we don't want them to come on board with a whole lot of nothing in a 2028 timeline, right? So the staffing structure we put together is so they still have influence, but that they're fully staffed up to hit the ground running and they have what they need to be successful between 2026 and 2028.
So for today's item is what you're looking for us to make a motion to be able to pursue the loan from SACOG, to be able to take next steps?
It's a multi-part staff recommendation. So I'm looking for general approval of the staffing approach. This combination of a tolling consultant and an executive director coming on board in the early part of 2026. That direction to pursue that additional loan from SACOG and that direction to staff to develop a report on the additional funding options for the longer term.
Yeah, I think it looks like a great timeline. I think it looks, I mean, I'm new on the board, but it looks like a great timeline, and finding an executive director and saying, hey, you're gonna have a stable job for year 1, 2, 3, and 4 is so important. Someone that's high quality is not gonna come into the organization and say, I'm ready to take this on, such a heavy lift, without some kind of secured funding source.
If I could through the chair, just so you understand too, all this came through the technical advisory group, and you have universal concurrence from us on this item to go with staff's recommendation. And just to highlight something that Secretary Portlis already said, it really is a very short list of people in this industry. Half of them are in the audience right now. But
Including you.
yeah, well, it's a very short list, and I wouldn't worry. You know, all the sort of policy conversations and everything that's been had, you know, being held is very mainstream to the industry. So I wouldn't worry about an executive director coming on board and not liking something regarding the toll policy or something physically around the first project. It's already been stated, but to reinstate it, they're going to want to know that there's a multi-year commitment to them. They're going to make, because the risk profile of coming and joining this agency is fairly high for somebody like that. So they're going to want a multi-year commitment.
That's
So it's all about the money.
That's awesome. That's very helpful. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick comment. I'll start off by saying that I think it's a good plan. I fully support it. So thank you, Kathleen, and all the staff that worked on this. I appreciate it. The other thing I'll just say is I think this plan lays this out, but there's a little bit of track record already, and thank you, SACOG, with some savings coming in. And we'll try to obviously continue to be as prudent as we can with the money. But then also there's the project schedule. I know we in Caltrans, we could, together with our contractor, own that, and we're certainly going to try to get this project done and opened up as soon as possible. So as we see how things play out over the next year, we can get a better idea of that opening date. Now, I'm not making any promises here by any means, but then we can start looking at that and when we can actually start tolling. And that is also part of the calculus that plays into all of this. And that's a major piece of it, right? So just making, my recommendation that I think this is a good plan, I'm sorry, and that we're certainly going to work together to try to get those lanes open as soon as we can when it's safe to do so.
Thank you, Director Sevis. Yeah, I think to underscore, first of all, thank you for that. I guess my question, Kathleen, or maybe James, under the funding options, we have the things that probably are unlikely, but then there are things that are likely. So we're probably going to start with the more likely scenarios. When do we need to have some assurances that we have some capacity to continue to sort of roll this forward under the loan space? And I say a loan because it's not a traditional loan, right? These are, I call it a guaranteed loan. Given what we project to be the tolling revenues in the very near future, I suspect I could probably say they're guaranteed loans. Money well spent. It's not normal that government entities loan money for these kinds of ventures. These are very non-traditional. In the State Association of Counties Finance Corporation space, we do this every day of the week. We are constantly loaning money to, in that incubator space for operations that we can almost guarantee are going to have revenue on the back end of the operation, such like we have here today. So I guess the question is, when do we need to know where the remaining 1.2
So
just for 24, 20,
Mm.
25, 26.
that's a great clarification I can make. So this remaining fiscal year 2025, 2026 need of 1.1, roughly speaking, at the bottom of this chart here, is what we're proposing we go for the SACOG loan to cover. So the issue is not what it's going to take to keep the lights on at CARTA starting July 1, 2025. The issue is these longer term pieces we've been talking about, the multi-year executive director contract, the multi-year tolling consultant contract, and we need to get that funding for that nailed down this summer.
Okay, so it
ideally.
doesn't start this year, it's out years then.
But we need a strong commitment, right? So you don't necessarily have to execute a loan agreement by this summer, but we're looking to identify to say, yes, this entity has a certain amount of money that they're willing to loan, and we can start talking about the terms of that, right? We can share with all of you, and it's a public record from last year, right? That SACOG and CARTA entered into a promissory note. So SACOG is guaranteed a repayment, and there's some options for, depending on the flexibility of when revenue actually starts to flow, of when SACOG will get paid back. And so we would be happy to talk with other agencies about kind of what we could structure, as CARTA staff to make that work
Okay.
and see how it benefits.
That's a
the
helpful
agency.
clarification. Thank you, Eric. That's helpful. I mean, it would seem to me we'd be best suited by pursuing it more aggressively on the front end rather than waiting and finding out later on that we're struggling to make up whatever the difference might be at that point, even though we know that the tolling revenues are projected to be whatever they are at that point. So, okay, that's helpful. All right, other thoughts or comments, questions? Thank you, Kathleen. This is very, very helpful. I like the graphical illustration. That's, at least to
Always
me,
good.
that's very helpful. Yep. All right. What is the pleasure of the board? Because it is an action item, so you do need some direction here.
Yeah, Chair, I'm happy to move staff recommendation in our packet.
All right. So
Early seconds.
we have a motion and a second by Director Sevis. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you very much. Good work. Thank you so much, Kathleen.
Great work.
All right, then that takes us to item 5 is the back office structure and welcome.
Hi. Good afternoon, directors. I'm Sam Souls. I'm the PM for the HNTB team working on the work plan and policy with CARTA. And today we have an action item in front of you about the back office structure. Now, in the informational segment, we're going to be doing a little bit more of a deep dive on Tolling 101, the bigger picture of tolling. But for this particular piece, we're looking for feedback and an action to be able to move forward with a general concept about how to go about getting a back office for CARTA, specifically on YOLO 80's timeline. We're going to do that by talking generally about the functions of a back office, as well as the various types of ways to contract for one, some compare and contrast on those, and then ultimately a recommendation for what we believe CARTA should move forward with. Now, when we say the words back office, sometimes you may hear this as a customer service center or a CSC. I'll talk briefly just about what a back office actually is. So anytime you call a customer service, any kind of payment processing, transaction processing, this is where all of that magic happens. So when we think about a toll transaction being formed at the roadside and the systems that look at the roadway elements, be able to identify a vehicle, price that vehicle, package that up, and send it somewhere, this is where it's going. And it's really comprised of 2 major components, which is the systems and the operations. So you have the actual system elements that interface with that roadside system, that are able to post transactions to accounts, establish and manage those accounts, talk to customers to be able to do their account functions, the online interfaces that work with those. And then you have the people that actually sit in those chairs, answer those calls, operate the system, and specifically look at reports and collect your revenue. So all of those accounting functions also happen here. Being able to post transactions, collect payment, reconcile that revenue, and do that on a routine daily, monthly basis. Lastly is the enforcement and collection. So whenever we have a transaction that does not have an account to go to, the escalation for that transaction, and we'll talk a little bit about that life cycle later. But really how you interface not just with your customers, but with potential violators to be able to go and chase that revenue down through the violation process. So the way you can get a contract, You can either procure or build a new system. Sometimes agencies that have been doing this for a very long time want a lot of control and a lot of very customized business requirements to be met through the system. They may opt to build their own. More commonly, they procure a new system. These are very large, high-risk procurements. They're very large, high-risk deployments because they are revenue-generating systems. So the time it takes to be able to scope that out, the cost of that, and the amount of vendors in the marketplace that come to the table can really drive a higher cost. The other option is to procure a system through an existing service provider. So this would be thinking something that is already existing, they're up, they're running, they're collecting tolls for one or more facilities. And really thinking about YOLO's goals is something that we really talked about a lot in this recommendation. And I just want to point some of those out to kind of give our mental framework of we want to do this really right to get the first project right. These are the people that are going to be interfacing with your customers. So there is a huge opportunity to make a great first impression. But we also need to do that on YOLO's timeline and really respect the fact that we have a schedule and some cost factors that need to be closely considered to be able to look at what's feasible, what's reasonable. I also want to point out this moment that this isn't necessarily a forever decision. You can agencies can do one thing for an amount of time, and it's really what is in your service agreement, what is in your contract that allows you to disentangle or migrate to a different model. So when we think about the immediate needs versus the long-term needs of a network, just know that what we talk about for YOLO doesn't necessarily have to sign you up for that very, decades-long network build-out. So looking at these two side by side, you can see here pretty clearly the implementation timeline. I'll also note that the implementation timeline for the building or procuring, that's a really best case. These projects, especially if you're building one, can take much longer than 3 years. And as I said, it's high risk, so it's not something you want to rush to failure on. Versus an existing provider, that timeline, the implementation is usually there, but a year to be able to understand what nuances CARTA may need in their business requirements or maybe in their financial reports to be able to work through some of those details. Implementation cost, huge delta there. Being able to hire and bring in software developers and report writers and things like that can take a lot of time and implementation, and that drives cost. The 2 to 4 million for an existing service provider, that can vary greatly on whether or not you are the tolerance for being able to adopt how someone's already operating. And if there's things that deviate from that, how much time and money that may take to be able to meet those custom needs. With delivery, we are dealing with a marketplace that has a fairly limited amount of providers in it. And so the risk of scope not being delivered on time and on budget is real and is experienced a lot across a number of toll agencies. The risk to CARTA for an existing service provider, on the other hand, would be that, not necessarily lack of autonomy, but if you really had a need, a specific nuance that you wanted to carry out, the risk of whether or not that would be supported and where that may rank within the priorities of another agency that would be using that same provider could come into play. We'll talk more about the larger CTOC network, but CARTA is going to be one of several toll providers, and these are all interoperable service providers. So coming in with a new vendor, procuring a new office, that would be a new interface to all of those other interfaces, whereas an existing service provider already has that happening, and those agreements are already in place. That really leads into the peer coordination and how much needs to happen just on being able to work with your toll community regional partners is a little bit of a bigger lift when you're starting something new. And then, as I mentioned, the control, just the amount of autonomy that you have, being able, we talk a lot about balancing that threading of the needle between how much you want to invest for something that's really uniquely CARTA and how that can be carried out through another agency's contract and contractor. So with that, the staff recommendation is that the board directs staff to pursue a back office system with an existing service provider. This would be an existing operator that is in California that meets the general regulatory and statutory needs for anything related to tolling legislation. And that we enter into that concept with the advanced planning and being able to explore what that looks like, as opposed to procuring a new system. So I'll take any questions or follow-up.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Are there any initial questions? Clerk, is there any slips for public comment on the item?
There's no public comments on this item.
Okay, can we bring it back in the body for further discussion, comments, questions, or a motion? We do have a staff recommendation. Is it? Well, hang on, we have one comment here.
Oh, no, sorry to delay this. Thank you, Chair. Just to say that I think that the choice is pretty obvious. I mean, it's for our size and trying to get started, I think procuring an existing provider is the way to go. And anyway, please support it. So, sorry.
Okay, very good. Any other comments?
I have a comment and then I'm seconding the motion. I think it not only makes sense from a cost perspective, I will always go back to our users in our community. And I think having continuity across the region as folks are potentially coming from the Bay Area would be ideal for customers, particularly as we're trying to ramp up. Obviously, it's always easier and less expensive to scale, and so from a business perspective, definitely makes sense. I even think from a user perspective that it makes a lot of sense.
Right. If there are no other comments or questions, we do have a motion, and I believe that was a second. All right, so we have a motion and a second on the item. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Hearing none, seeing none, motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. That's great work.
If I could, Mr. Chair, I'll just add a brief comment. So what's going to happen now that you all have went with staff recommendation, we're going to put out the back call to the other tolling authorities in California that were interested in this, get a sense of who might be interested in working with us. And then from who's working with us, try to understand how their rules are, what their cost model is, and bring back options if there are any for this board to consider. So we'll give you an update once we have a sense of what's out there.
Very good. Perfect. Perfect next step. Thank you, Kathleen, again. Yep. Okay, those are the action items. We now are into the informational items, and we have items 6, 7, and 8. Item 6 is the Tolling 101 workshop. Who's leading that?
Hello again. You're going to get too much of me today. I apologize.
Never.
All right. For this informational item, we have a tolling 101. This is an introduction to tolling. I'm going to move at this slide deck. If you've seen how big it is, we're going to move across it at a pretty high clip. And I'm going to do my best to point out specific areas that are really important for the immediate decision-making needs out of CARTA. So as we go through this, if you have any questions or want to do a deep dive at some other time, we can talk to Kathleen, and I'm happy to sit with you and fully geek out. But for today, we're going to try and get some vocabulary and some general framework around what tolling is. All right, big picture, just the idea of why we toll. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the history of tolling, because the legacy of how tolling came about and why still frames a lot of the policies in modern day toll systems and operations and policy. If you think about the last time the gas tax was increased, the buying power just isn't there. So really thinking about other types of toll facilities that aren't necessarily express lanes was really the impetus for tolling. It was being able to fund large capital infrastructure that had no other means to fund. And that just became more and more important to several markets and states, as the need to have more infrastructure was just not supported by the traditional funding mechanisms. That later expanded really more into congestion pricing, where we were looking to use pricing as a way to increase the value and availability of existing infrastructure, that really heavy asset that's available, in a way that could be used to improve mobility through pricing and mode choice. Now, understanding that all tolling agencies are unique, and this is, if you look across just the US market, if you could toggle between the important pieces here, that if you have a huge peer network, you will see agencies that are very focused on the business side, the revenue. They may have toll revenue backed bonds, for example. And so their debt service is the most important, whereas other agencies may be more interested in that customer experience and being a little bit more lenient on revenue collection. And I think we've talked a little bit about that. So just keep in mind those really key performance metrics of what makes a good toll program, of serving the customer really well and having a good experience there, collecting your revenue, and then having a facility that performs. These are kind of the toggles that various agencies use to get at their particular objectives. I mentioned your peer network. This is kind of, this can feel overwhelming, but this is your new, these are all your new neighbors. And all those darker blue dots, those are the back offices. That's what we were just talking about. This is why being able to not become a new blue dot is really great for time and money. And you can see the number of facilities that are served across these. And all of these agencies and back offices have nuances within their business rules, the way they collect, the way they pursue violators. So really being able to understand that consistency of customer experience, this really represents what that looks like statewide. And then of course, as you drill down regionally, it can get even more nuanced. I'm going to introduce some general tolling concepts, and we're going to stick to all electronic tolling. I'm sure you guys have been through a toll booth at some point where you actually put change in a basket or something. There's not many of those left, but that was never an option, obviously, for express lanes. So we're going to really stick to all electronic tolling, which is being able to collect tolls by identifying, detecting and identifying a vehicle, confirming that through either a toll tag or a license plate, and being able to assign some sort of charge, maybe an equity discount, to that particular vehicle. So the roadside systems use this using RFID technology. That's a fast track transponder. It's a requirement that that can be the only payment device in the vehicle per a Title 21 requirement that is held by Caltrans for the state to make sure that we don't have a bunch of fast track tag competitors out there. Keeps it for interoperability, so you can go all up and down the state and use the same tag, and all those blue dots on that map are what talk to each other in the background to see that your toll from LA got posted to your account in San Francisco, for example. There's a number of components, and we've talked about these, so I think you can kind of picture the framework in your mind that you have your tag in your car. It's talking to roadside equipment. That roadside equipment is talking to what we call a host. Sometimes you will hear the host also referred to as a back office. So don't get confused by that. There's an express lanes host, and I'll go into that in a moment. And that host serves as kind of the brains between the roadside and what it actually packages up and sends to the back office. So those are the four major elements. And for CARTA right now, the roadside equipment will be one piece, and then with the toll host. So host and roadside talk to each other, and our one system that's likely to be procured within one contract. And then the back office system will provide that tag distribution and fulfillment function. We have different types of tags. The sticker transponder is easily the most affordable. It uses a technology that is passive, so it's a very simple read on a vehicle. The standard transponder is probably what you've seen in the Bay Area and throughout California for a really long time, before the dawn of express lanes, which needed some flexibility, fast track flex, which is the driver can flip the switch to declare their occupancy, and then the roadside system can see that and discount based on how many people they claim to be in the car. This is one we'll talk about more when we start talking about some of the policies around occupancy and what the lessons learned are recently for occupancy declaration. This is a beautiful roadside system. There are a lot of different elements that come together, but if you think about it, this is really what drives infrastructure. This is why you need gantries that are over the road. This is why you need cabinets and pads that are within a certain proximity to those gantries. And this is really an extension of traditional infrastructure design to make sure that the physical poles, infrastructure are there, but also the comms and the electrical pieces that aren't really, you can't really see here, but that all of this stuff has to talk to something and relay back to something else. And this is what is gathering at the front side that's sending data back to that host. So a modern back office we covered, so I'm not going to recover this, but you can see that if you think about contracting with a service provider, this becomes very turnkey with some nuanced decisions to be made in there. Like, are you going to send a piece of paper that says invoice or violation? Those are some of the things that we'll be talking to you about. Now, the host, as I said, is really the brains. It's what's telling the lane side system what the toll rate is. If you're dynamically priced, it's churning through traffic data and understanding the volumes, the speeds, to be able to set that demand-based pricing. It sends it back out to the sign, and then when it's taking in, identifying vehicles, detecting vehicles, seeing a tag, seeing a plate, it's saying this car was here at this time, here's the number it should be. It also provides the system monitoring. So these systems all come turnkey with self-monitoring, reporting on performance and whether or not the system's up. So if we have a camera go out or a reader loses power, there's little trouble tickets and things like that in the system that are able to be maintained usually by the same provider that gave you the system. We also use that for reporting on roadside level data. So you're able to really see not just the performance of the system itself, but you can look at that data immediately and see the performance of your lane. So if you wanted to look at something like speeds or how many vehicles had fast track or how many vehicles were HOV2 versus HOV3, there's a lot of data that sits in that system that you can tap before it even gets to your back office. This is another look just showing the kind of bifurcation. And this is important to see from a standpoint of when you think about which provider is providing which service to you. And when that service is not provided at the level that you are supposed to have, this is where understanding the demarcation between responsibility becomes really important. If the lane side system does something wrong and sends an incorrect transaction to the back office can't do anything with it. That's a lane side system. So when you think about those actual contracts and where that obligation, that risk, those requirements have to live, this is a really good way to think about the demarcation in a really linear way. There are a number of pricing mechanisms. You could think of bridges as a fixed toll rate, but there are a number of fully tolled facilities and express lanes that have fixed rates. That's just where the rates are a flat rate, regardless of conditions in the facility. Rates can differ between cash and electronic. There's when a lot of facilities were converting from cash, they gave a discount to electronic because it was representative of the operational cost to collect electronically versus cash. Time of day is a steady schedule that is set into the system that recognizes that there are peak times and off-peak times. So if you wanted to have a schedule that had higher rates at morning and evening commute times, and then a slower rate at the middle of the day, and then nothing overnight, that's really time of day. And sometimes you'll hear that called variable, and it gets confusing between variable and dynamic. So I'm just trying to get our vocabulary straight here that's what we're going to call time of day. Dynamic is where it's actually responding in real time using the conditions of the roadway to be able to synthesize and understand what the price for that demand should be. And that's done through an algorithm that comes with the toll host piece of the system. Payment methods, this is a really important one to think about. Even though we're all electronic on the physical roadway, being able to allow for cash collection is still something that's very much at the top of mind of operators. We do still look at FDIC reports, for example, and understand that unbanked and underbanked people really do need easy ways to pay. They are sometimes more the expensive elements of your operation, but they're very necessary to allow that way to be able to collect, whether it's being able to fund an account or pay an invoice or pay a violation. Prepaid toll accounts is really the preference. I mean, that's kind of the gold standard across our agencies. And if you look at the highest performing toll agencies in the US, they have upwards of 85, 90% of their tolls collected through prepaid accounts. These are customers that we almost never even interface with. They have a credit card on the account that's replenishing based on these amounts, and that money sits in their account and replenishes, and they use it. And there's not a lot of interaction with them. We don't have a reason to send them any kind of piece of paper. And so those surveys are always fun to see what people think when you're not talking to them a lot, and how well their self-help piece of the website is. Let's see, and then we have, okay, we did this waterfall chart, and I think I want to point out, I won't walk through every little step, but if you think about that 90%, for example. So out of all of your traffic, let's say 90% of those vehicles have a fast track account. It's paid at that moment. So your revenue curve is very, very short when you can get people into accounts that are pre-funded. Out of that, you may have a certain amount that gets an invoice or a violation, and that's another percentage. That curve starts getting very, very, very long. So when we think about what we call leakage, which are the pink boxes, this is where you have your revenue eroded. So starting at the top, it happens to the lane side system when there are just pieces of data that we cannot form into a pursuable transaction. And you're always going to have a little bit of leakage that has to be within tolerance because it is technology and it's not constantly perfect. Out of the trips that are built, and these are sample percentages, but you may have 2% that are non-revenue. Some tags are non-revenue by statute, and you may have programs where you may have contractors, or we have some states that have veteran populations that are just non-revenue. That's another point of leakage. Then when you come down to the last piece of this 37% of invoice and violations, those ones that don't get paid by the fast track account, that's where you see that tail of revenue getting really, really long. Now in California, you're able to actually hold someone's DMV registration. So that unpaid percentage is probably a little bit high for what we see, because you're able to really recoup those costs when someone goes to register their vehicle. Sometimes it's the first time they found out they even owe the money, or that they've found they've been caught for not paying their tolls. So we do have a long trail between DMV holds and collections agencies to be able to capture this revenue. But again, all of that equals operational costs along the way. Okay, when we think about the policy framework, toll policy, which is what we will be bringing to you, is driven by the agreements that are already in place and the general concept of how you plan to operate. So the policy that we bring to you will come with that lens of being able to stay within that framework. Beyond policy, we have to go into all of the various use cases of how things can go wrong or how some customer may need to be handled. And that lives in the business rules. Business rules are the things that deal with the really happy path of if everything goes perfectly, this is how we want to do this. And if this goes wrong, this is how we want to handle it. And that's something that is important for CARTA to be able to hand to their vendors. So when you have a service provider, you're telling them, my business rule is that if someone drives the lane and didn't know they were in the lane and they call, I want that first one to be free. So your service provider can meet your business rule that ultimately rolls up to your policy. It also relates to system requirements. I mentioned if you say we're going to have HOV 2+ versus 3, and this should be the discount, that's something in the system that we would say to the roadside vendor, you need to be able to read a tag at these different statuses. So this is kind of the buildup of that hierarchy that actually lives in real life documents and is something that we bake into whether it's an interagency agreement or a service contract. This is where all of that really gets cemented for good operations. All right, did I go too fast? Was that okay?
I think it was a lot to cover. I'll just add before we turn it back over that, right, meant to be high level. We're going to dive in more detailed workshops over the course of the year on just pricing structure, just discounts, just what kind of vehicles, right? So you're going to have a lot of bites at this apple, but just, right, fresh, full board for 2025. Y'all are the folks who are going to be making these decisions, want to set the table with a bit of a 101.
And that's it?
Yes,
I mean,
sir.
I'm not saying there needs to be more.
I mean,
I'm just
I
saying
will go on.
No, no,
I
no,
will go on
please.
any of this that you want me to. I love talking about this stuff.
I,
So.
well, I'm gonna say it was very well done because I actually understood it. So, are there any, I know we have slip to speak on this item, at least one. Are there any initial questions by anybody? No? Okay, Michael.
Chair, if I could?
Yes,
Sorry.
jump right in, yeah.
Sam, could you just quickly go back to slide 18? And I know, as Kathleen said, we'll talk about this throughout the year. But just for clarification, and just because if, in case we never see this slide again, this is a wonderful slide. And so is it fair to say, as this board considers policy or business rules or anything of that nature, decisions that take us away from the prepaid fast track payment option, that that is taking us further away from guaranteed revenue? That puts more revenue at risk when we get away from that gold standard of the prepaid fast track account. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. I mean, it's really where you start. There's a saying of, paying a dollar to chase a dime. And mostly that's because there are statutory requirements that you have to be able to, you have to send a violation to the registered vehicle owner's address. So think about how many people you know and how many times they've moved and they said, I need to go change my registration address on top of everything else. So finding people afterwards in a post-paid transaction scenario, you're immediately looking at some leakage. And then the operational cost to go put a stamp on that envelope, mail it, hope it gets there, it may come back. Now you're in collections. DMV holds are $3 a piece. So you're starting to really pay real money out of pocket to be able to chase that revenue. And that the flip side is the customer experience of, wanting to maybe not get a violation, but agencies that switched to invoicing wanted to have that initial piece of paper be a positive experience to say, hey, like you're not a customer yet, but here's your invoice and you could be.
I appreciate that. And thank you for the, and just, we had a deep dive on this with the technical team, and everyone will have different numbers. But to give you an idea, on average, that fast track transaction, you can think of that as costing you 12, 15, 20 cents. And you can think of that other transaction as costing you $2 to $3 for context.
Yeah,
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. And on that note, so do people tend, I mean, and maybe this is for a question for later down the road as we actually have to dive into these questions as a policy framework, but do people already start using the system and then decide to go the prepaid path? Or is that something that people just naturally fall into because they already know? Or how does that, what's your experience with that?
So it really depends on what your strategy is to be able to penetrate a market with tags. So some of the facilities that open in new markets with the highest tag penetration have done a very hard push campaign, giving away free tags, going into neighborhoods, distributing them, doing a lot of collateral materials, a lot of public partnerships with retail, and really just trying to get it out there. And that investment pays off because of exactly what we were talking about with the cost of being able to chase that $2.50 transaction versus a 20-cent one. So it depends on the strategy. And I'm happy to take these kind of questions because it also helps us understand where you guys may want to have more of a deep dive. So please feel free to ask questions or just say what you're really interested in.
To piggyback off of Director Villegas' question, you said, is it 80 or 90% of those customers that we don't have to interface? What was the percentage that you said?
It fully depends on how many fast tracks we end up having in the region, right? And so right now, we're a pretty unpenetrated market, right? Because we don't have any toll bridges or toll lanes. And so the vast majority of our folk were paying cash on the Bay Bridge once a quarter. And now since COVID, get an invoice in the mail when they cross the Bay Bridge and they go online and they pay their invoice, they don't have a fast track account. So we're gonna have to do a lot of what Sam is saying to get that number up as high as we can.
But in other markets, you said, oh, I thought you were saying other markets have.
Yeah, in one of my
examples of
in one of my previous projects, we spent $5 million in marketing in a very large scale market and opened with 92% penetration of tags.
Okay.
That was giving away free tags and doing a lot of paid and earned media.
And so when the customers got the tags already and they were front loading money onto it so that they don't have to pay as they go. Do you know what the average dollar amount that people front loaded onto the tag was?
So
there
that's
any
usually
data
a
on that?
replenishment amount that's set. So for example, in the Bay Area, it's $25 that's put on as a replenishment amount. And if you think about someone commuting, that's about, well, not now, but it was close to a week worth of bridge tolls.
Mhm.
And then based on usage, that replenishment amount can change. So if the system sees you driving a lot and using express lanes every day and using the bridges all the time, and you're running closer to $50 a week, then your replenishment amount will go up.
Okay. And then is there a time, I'm new on the board, so is there a timeline of like when we hope to have these policies in place, like a date?
So the current work that we're doing, as far as the work plan and near-term policy approval is laying that out. So right now we're planning the plan of understanding which policies which policies can feasibly be done sooner than later. So that's what we'll be coming back to you. So we'll start building a policy framework and basically taking chunks of policies that will move through kind of a pipeline of approval that will eventually get you before YOLO 80 is opened.
Got it. Okay, and then I'm on STA, and so I get to be here because my colleagues allowed me to be here, and it's a big board. And so I don't want to be the sole opinion for STA for all my members. I want to be able to hear from them and their opinions on policy. So maybe in the future, working with Kevin Busey, our executive director, to do a presentation at STA so that I can bring back the feedback of my entire Sacramento County colleagues. Would be greatly appreciated.
We'd be happy to.
And then Kathleen, thank you so much for your comments on talking about discounts and pricing and everything else later. You know, equity is an important thing for me. And I just want to make sure that as we craft policy, we're keeping in mind the farm workers that have to drive and are already feeling the impact of inflation and high pricing. And so that's going to be front, mind, and center for me.
Appreciate that. And to your question on timing, Director Talamontes. Appreciate that. And to your question on timing, Director Talamontes, the plan for these toll policies is to chunk them off, right? What we could do is come and say, here's 14 toll policies, say yes. And so instead, what we're going to do is bring, okay, who's going to be allowed to use the lane? Question one. Question two, who's going to get a discount? Are we going to require fast track? Are we going to waive the first invoice? So we're going to bundle ones together that make sense, bring them to you in pieces to take an opinion on. And then the idea is at the end of the year to wrap it all up with a resolution, put pen to paper and say, okay, the sequence of decisions we made over the course of 2025 together, put this in writing, and then for future CARTA boards to consider as they implement.
Director Talamontes and Chair Villegas, I also would say, so I'm heading down to the Bay Area this weekend, might take Capitol Corridor. But if not, gonna get my fast track out, right? And if you don't have a fast track to use down in the Bay Area, just for all of you, it's great because you actually get to see, right? What Sam was just describing and sort of what the amount you replenish, the travel time savings you have in the toll lanes, right? The variable pricing. So anyway, just highly encourage if you're heading down there in a vehicle, it's a handy thing to have.
I've been on my sister's fast track for 10 years and she doesn't know.
You won't tell. I get on that one.
That's allowed. That's allowed. It's not like Netflix. You're allowed to do that.
It is, and recorded.
Don't worry, she doesn't watch government meetings.
Very
Thank
good.
you, Olga.
Yeah, these are great questions, and thank you for sort of prompting us to ask sort of the obvious questions, because I think as we get further and down the road, obviously a lot of these questions are going to be addressed by the TAC before they come to us, so there's some vetting. But I'm intrigued by this notion that we can really avoid, as you say, kind of spending a dollar to chase a dime on the front end by maybe front loading some of our efforts to really educate folks who don't even know what they don't know. Why front loading a card on is going to save everybody time, energy, and money. That's intriguing to me. I definitely want to, and I think that's going to be worth pursuing in light of the fact that it's going to be new to the region, right? It's going to be the first introduction to a lot of folks who are going to be using it on a regular basis, what value it has to them. I think that's one way to present it. So, okay. So
Okay.
yeah.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to just take public comment unless there's something to add. Nope. That's a no. Okay. All right. So Michael, you want to join us on public comment? We'll take comments now. And if you've got a slip, come on up.
So one thing I'm going to talk about in reference is this. So I like how we're going into the policy discussion, and just having a conversation about it. Earlier at the SACOG board meeting, there was a question by Roseville Mayor and Director Howdeschelt about Capital Corridor, CARTA, and what could be the outcomes of operations for Capital Corridor services, especially as they look at SR3T, Sacramento Roseville third track, and getting 2 initial new round trips, but ultimate build out to 10 additional round trips to Roseville. So I was thinking, well, I think that should be a priority as a policy, but maybe not the top priority. Remember, this all was born because it came out of what was then called the YOLO 80 managed lanes, and hence why we're all here today. So my priority, and it's whenever I get the opportunity to get to Woodland on the second Monday nights of each month, or send comments electronically to the staff and the chair, that the first priority should be, out of the outcomes of the funding from tolls coming from CARTA, is on this. So for those that can't see, behind me in the audience, this is the 42A and 42B schedule. And it highlights 30-minute service during peak hours. And then the rest of the day, I was looking at once every 45 minutes. Those should be every 30 minutes. So there are 16 precious trips missing from the schedule. And because they're not what Sacramento County would refer to as a self-help county, which is one who is dependent and has a measure. And thank you for Director Talamontes. You stole my thunder a bit. I want to recognize in the audience Kevin Busey, of the Executive Director of STA, and they exist because of Measure A. But Measure A may not be all things to the other counties. And so the funding from tolling, if a county doesn't elect to go by the avenue of a self-help sales tax, this would help get, and I'll recognize Executive Director Autumn Bernstein and Director of Planning Brian Abinat in the audience of the YOLO Transportation District, the funds that they need, and then eventually to hire the operators from TransDev, get the buses they need to procure on the capital side to operate truly a 30-minute frequency the entire span of service of the 42A and B, with multiple cities and 2 counties. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. I don't have any other slips to speak. Robert, any others?
That's the only public comment on this.
Okay, take it back. Bring it back to the board for further comments or questions. This is informational only. Seeing no other comments, that takes us then to item 7. It's the YOLO 80 open access trade-offs.
I'm going to give this a little tee off. So this is a unique item, item 7. So in addition to your CARTA staff bringing you key policy issues, we also want to bring to the CARTA board discussions that are happening with the members on issues related to tolling that are important to CARTA and to its needs. So this is an example of that. So you're going to get a presentation on some of the discussion that YOLO Transportation District and Caltrans are having on the design of YOLO 80 related to whether or not you're able to get in and out of the toll lane at any time. As project sponsors, this decision is really YOLO TD's and Caltrans's to make. But because CARTA ultimately is going to operate this facility and is going to have receive the outcomes, right, in lost revenue, increased cheating, safety, some of these issues that CARTA is going to have to deal with, we want to make sure that this board was aware of the trade-offs that these 2 agencies are considering and able to provide feedback on the discussion. So this is an information item. This decision is not CARTA's to make, but YOLO TD and Caltrans have requested the board's feedback. So you're going to get 2 presentations. One is from YOLO TD's consultant on what the design options really are on YOLO 80. And then the second is from Sam, our consultant at CARTA, on sort of like, what does it mean? What should CARTA consider? What should CARTA's opinion be on this? Happy to hand it over to you, Shadi.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good afternoon. My name is Shadi Shazbek. I'm with Kimberly Orr and Associates, and as Kathleen mentioned, we're a consultant for YOLO TD. Our role is to coordinate the civil design and the toll system integrator that's going to come on board later this year. So it's turning to be quite a busy presentation today for you, but sorry for the technical details, but we're going to get right into it. So who's running the slide for us? Oh, okay, thanks. So we've got 3 items on this presentation: is overview of the current constraints and challenges as the project is currently designed. We're going to talk specifically today about the separation between the managed lane and the adjacent general purpose lane, and give you an idea of what options are there today in the world of managed lanes. And then we're going to dive a little bit more into details about how the facility is currently designed and some proposed modifications. So just to give you an overview, the project goals is really to enhance safety in the corridor, manage congestion on the causeway and the entire 80 corridor, improving travel time reliability, and we've heard today a lot about that, and then also meeting the VMT commitments that the project has made. And all of these elements require obviously funding to go with them. So the causeway particularly is current design as an open access, which means you can get in and get out of the lane anywhere you want, similar to a lot of the express lanes in the Bay Area, for example. So the lane is separated from the adjacent lane with just simple skip stripe, like a single white stripe that's dashed. The causeway itself, the bridge, has a very limited space. The project does not include widening of the causeway, as we know. And Caltrans design team did the best they could with available space. So they reduced shoulder width on the inside. They've reduced lane width on the bridge to accommodate the additional lane that's going to get through. So we were down to, on average, about 2-foot inside shoulder and a 10-foot outside shoulder, which is the standard, and then 11-foot lanes for majority of the cross sections. The current design, however, does not have any read points on the causeway. So that whole 4-mile section, there's no toll read points on it as currently designed, mainly because of some constraints with permitting and other things that still need to get done and takes longer time to get approved. And generally speaking, if space is available and not an issue, lane separation would be something that Caltrans would support for managed lanes. But we don't have that in the causeway currently. And then we're also looking at, is there a potential to add these toll reads? Like if you have the room or you don't have the constraints, adding those toll reads in a continuous access express lane or an open access would be one way to go. So what are the challenges? The challenges with this project right now is that the open access without any read points for a 4-mile plus section of the freeway would encourage cheating. And Sam talked about the leakage earlier in the slide. We don't have the full modeling done. This work is just started, but on very, very rough estimate, we were projecting about 10 to 15% revenue leakage with the 4-mile section of the freeway. That just, again, preliminary, subject to further refinement and more modeling that's happening later this year. It's going to be very challenging to install toll gantries on the causeway structure. One, from structure perspective, those toll gantries have to meet certain design criteria for wind loading and withstand all the weather element, but also the toll system itself has criteria for vibration and deflection, where if it shakes too much, then you can't get an accurate read. So there's other criteria on top of your regular overhead gantry that the design needs to meet. The causeway is a choke point, as we all know. Google this morning sent me up through Woodland Hill because there was an accident on the freeway. So it's a choke point. It's a big area where not having any ability to separate the lane and manage the lane would encourage people to cheat. And with the congestion in the general purpose lane, that's an invitation for people to bypass it. Changes to this design at this point where we are today with the contract, it's going to require a change order for the contractor since they're already under contract with Caltrans, which means that's an increased cost to the contract. And the project, as we all know, has very limited funding for construction. So that's another challenge. And then implementing the lane separation if we were to come back and do some changes to the plan, and let's say we created a buffer stripe between the managed lane and the GP lane, that require further reduction in width, either in lane or in shoulder, which would require design exceptions approval from Caltrans. So how are managed lanes separated typically? Just in a broader category, there are two types of separations. There's a physical separation. That's usually either a concrete barrier or sometimes the plastic pylons, the tubular delineators that you see. And there are the softer separation, which are either a striped buffer, two stripes next to each other, solid stripes, or similar to what's currently designed, solid or dash stripe, single stripe between the lanes. So a barrier separation, the gold standard would be a physical barrier separating the lanes where you can get in and get out only at specific locations. Usually that type of design is implemented when you have longer trips that you're trying to favor because you don't have a lot of intermediate access points. So that's what you have with a physical barrier. Sometimes this is coupled with a reversible lane concept. You have barriers on both sides, and then in the middle, you reverse the lane. Sometimes it's 1 and 1, 2 and 2, 3 and 1. So San Diego is a perfect example. If you've ever been on the I-15 in San Diego, that's kind of the gold standard of barrier separated facilities. That one is about 20 or so miles, and it's only about 2 or 3 access points for the entire stretch. The next one is pylons or tubular delineators. It's a flexible material. They're installed in a buffer stripe between the lanes, but you have that vertical separation in addition to the stripe. The technology on the design and the material has gotten better over the years for these tubular pylons. They're designed to withstand impact. They come back to an upright position, but I'm not gonna, fool you. They do need to be replaced. Some of them come off the pavement, so there is an ongoing operation cost to replace those delineators at these facilities. But generally, they're easier to replace. Usually, they're bolted into the pavement, so they're easier to replace. When we go to a softer separation, you get the stripe buffer or the lane stripe. You're familiar with those in the Bay Area on 580 and 680. It's either a double white line for a buffer, typically 2 to 4 feet buffer, or a single dash stripe like is currently designed on YOLO 80. So there have been a lot of studies on separations, as you can imagine, but there's different findings. But the common theme is that there's something called the friction effect, which basically when you have a open access lane, you get a higher friction between the general purpose lane and the HOV/managed lane because drivers don't know when people can jump in front of them or jump out of them. They don't know they're going to slow down or get out. And there's a lot of sensitivity to that. So there's a higher friction factor, which means you got less throughput in the corridor. There's also the violation aspect of this that I would highlight, that when you get a lot more violation in the lane, then the pricing doesn't affect the violators because they're not paying. So you're trying to impact the amount, how many people are getting in the lane with the pricing in dynamic pricing situation. The violators don't care, and then you end up with less ability to manage the lane. So in a sense, safety violation of the crossing on the line is a safety concern. The pylon or the barrier separation eliminate that weaving concern, so that's a benefit. As I said, modeling is just starting, but we're projecting 10 to 15% leakage if we don't have any separation at all. And then express lane performance and travel time reliability will be impacted by the traveler using the express lane as a passing lane. Now, why do we care and why now? We care because right now, as we know, we have a design that's going to start construction in April. Making any changes to the civil design plans and the package requires time. We got to develop the plans. We got to go through contract negotiations with the contractor and pricing, and we have to order the materials. That's on the civil side. On the toll system technology side, if we decide to add more toll readers on the causeway, for example, or do something different on the toll system requirement, we would need to know that right now as well, because we're in the process of developing the RFP for the toll system integrator. So any changes to the infrastructure that's going to be out there, we would need to know that to convey that to all the potential bidders on the TSI system. So just a high-level comparison. Advantages of a physical separation: we don't have any weaving, improved safety, reduced violation, easier to enforce, protection of the express lane revenue. Again, when you have that separation, you don't have that leakage. And then more reliable travel time for all users, including the transit vehicles that's going to potentially use the corridor. More effective use of the dynamic pricing because you don't have the violators, so your pricing is more effective in managing the demand and allow you to really use that lane as a managed lane. And the pylons have one advantage of a physical barrier, which is it allows emergency vehicle to respond. So emergency vehicles can always drive over the delineators and get into the lane and respond to incident versus if we had a physical concrete barrier, you're restricted to just the specific access points. We're not asking for a barrier, but we're asking for some kind of separation. The disadvantages eliminates the flexibility for the shorter trips when we place the pylons. The concrete barrier requires more space, which we don't have. The pylons would increase maintenance and operation costs. As I mentioned, you're gonna have to maintain them and replace them on a regular basis. And then when we increase the physical separation and we place pylons or barriers, you limit all the weaving or you concentrate all the weaving to the opening points. So those would become a potential for bottlenecks or some safety concerns as well. If we compare that to the soft separation, minimal to no additional space required when we were talking about just paint. The provide flexibility for emergency incident response, similar to the pylons. There's no physical separation, so they can get in, get out. And reduce maintenance costs because we don't have the additional cost of maintaining the pylons or the barrier. The disadvantages, the weaving creates those operational and safety challenges, as we mentioned. Increased violation, harder to enforce, less reliable travel time. And we would need additional gantries on the causeway if we were to continue with an open access configuration. So you do need additional infrastructure eventually. So some cross sections. Here's the design of what look like. The numbers are the toll read points that are in the current plans. As you can see, there is a big gap in the middle. On the causeway, it's about 4 miles long, where we don't have any toll read currently in the design plans. Here's the cross section of what is on the causeway west segment. You could see the 2-foot inside shoulder and the 10-foot outside shoulders and the 11-foot lanes. Again, as I mentioned, Caltrans have narrowed all the cross sections to squeeze an extra lane to make this happen. What we're thinking we could potentially go further is to reduce the shoulder further in, either the inside shoulder or the outside shoulder, by another foot, and that would give us a 1-foot buffer. It's a very small buffer, but that's how you could create the additional space you need for that buffer. And in that one buffer, you could place the pylons. Or you could squeeze it even further and you go down to it. You increase your buffer to 2 feet, but you lose all the shoulders on the inside and then potentially some of the shoulder on the outside. Now, I do want to caveat outside shoulder is a very important part of a design. It's an emergency response. It's a breakdown lane. It's one of the last things that you would want to reduce on a cross section. We recognize that. But between 9 and 10 feet, you could still squeeze an emergency response in it. But there's concern that somebody opening their door, getting out of the car. We recognize this is not ideal, but again, we're working within the constraints that are available. Causeway East is similar situation, narrow inside shoulder, little wider, but still narrow. The proposal is to also narrow the inside shoulder further to create a 1-foot buffer, or narrow it even further to create a 2-foot buffer. And then off the causeway, we have a little bit more room. There's more shoulders off the causeway, so there's more room to create that buffer. Again, by taking 1 or 2 feet away from each shoulder to create the buffer between the managed lane and the general purpose lane. Now, on the toll readers, if we continue with an open access lane configuration, we would need some additional toll readers on the causeway. Currently, they're not in the design, but there's been work being done towards getting to that solution eventually. We also need, with toll readers, you need fiber optic communication and power to get to those readers. So that needs to also be part of the design. There's some challenges around the structure design, as I mentioned, but there's also the environmental constraints. I've heard today that no lighting is allowed on the bridge for environmental constraints. So there's some challenges we've got to work our way through to get to that solution. additional power and communication, and opportunity to use other technologies to toll the traffic in the lane using license plate reader. And what that means is that instead of having the big gantry with the infrastructure and the toll read, you could have a infrastructure light where you could use a camera to read a license plate, and then you can tie that license plate to a toll tag, and that's how you achieve the tolling on the freeway. So there's some potential innovation ideas here that we can look into on the causeway. License plate cameras would supplement. They'd be mounted to the side of the causeway without a mast arm above. We could use the license plate read technology. We correlate it with a license plate tag, and then we can provide a toll system redundancy. So you would read the people off the causeway with the infrastructure already planned, but on the causeway, you would read them through a license plate technology, and that would provide that system redundancy. And one of the drawbacks is that anytime you put causeway infrastructure on the causeway and you have to maintain it, we gotta close the lanes to get access to that infrastructure. But more typically, those are done during nighttime and off-peak hours. And I think Sam is gonna have some more on why this means for CARTA.
So we'll entertain a question if we can before we
Yeah.
transition.
I have a couple,
Sure.
and I'll try to make them really easy and fast. I just want a clarifying question on the soft versus the physical barrier, versus no barrier. Where any are options, right? No barrier at all, soft or I don't know, physical, is that what we're
Uh-huh.
calling it?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't want to say some cool stuff. Okay, and I guess my only thought is the potential that it would not always be open. Meaning that sometimes we haven't decided that it's always 24/7 going to be tolling versus high peak, and the impact that having a physical versus a soft versus no would have on the fact that it potentially wouldn't 24/7 be tolling. I guess I just want to make sure I at least throw that out there.
Excellent point. So yes, you have to consider what your tolling policy is going to be. That would influence your design, your civil design elements. So if it is physical separation, then you are limited to the opening that are with that physical separation, even during non-toll hours. So
And the only
yeah.
reason why I call that out is I actually do commute quite a bit to go to my YTD meetings and housing meetings and all the meetings across the causeway. And right now they're actually working on it. And so you are currently experiencing physical barriers as you're trying to get through. And if you don't, quickly pivot or turn when you're supposed to, then you're just stuck there, right, for a while. And so I'm noting that and flagging that as someone who like very much traverses back and forth on a regular basis. Okay, so that would be one thing I would note. And then I would be remiss if I didn't note for my colleague here, the bats. The bats are very precious. Part of what you talked about on the lighting is we do have a habitat that we want to conserve as much as we can, despite what some of our business folks have brought in, like Amazon, and disrupting that. And so I do want to flag that is very, very important to us in Yolo County.
One thing that you can see in other facilities also, just to add on the first question, is that it doesn't have to be one or the other. Sometimes these facilities are designed as a hybrid. So some segments have barrier or buffer. Some segments have just the dash stripes, as in the case in the Bay Area Express lanes, where they were designed, just the safety discussion drove where the buffer went and where it didn't go. But some of these facilities that we see across the nation also are hybrid. They don't have to be all one type.
Yep.
Okay.
I appreciate you making that last point, because that's, and obviously, if say the decision is made to just put no barrier, just two solid white lines for now, you can always go back and add a soft barrier later as you
Correct.
see the travel pattern and the impact.
And the leakage, we're learning.
And the leakage.
Yeah.
And I may or may not have seen someone on this dais weaving to avoid a gantry, Oscar.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But I did actually have a question about the weaving, because you do see it in other places throughout the state. I've certainly never done it. But do you have any crash statistics on that? Because it seems it is a very dangerous practice that people get into when they try to avoid the gantries.
Yeah, I don't have a specific number, but I'll give you an example of what Colorado ended up doing. For example, on their managed lane, when they saw a lot of people crossing the double white lines, they invested into a license plate technology where they would read the license plate of the people who are crossing and they send a violation on that.
Okay,
Oh.
great.
And,
yeah.
and that
Like
has,
another
reduced that
automated
violation
enforcement.
by about
Yeah.
82 or 90%. So it's a common problem, people weaving across these stripe lines, and then some other DOTs are taking initiative to fix that
Yeah.
problem. Yeah.
I'm not sure that's allowed in California as an automated
It's a
enforcement
little
measure.
it's a little more complicated here, as
Yeah.
are all things. Yes, Director Desmond. But
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
if it's okay, I think I'd like to transition to having Sam present to
Great.
you all, right? So Shadi gave you an overview of what the options are on the table. Again, it's not CARTA's decision to make, but what Sam's going to say is, from our perspective as CARTA staff, here's what we think about these pros and cons.
So Sam, before you get started, just for time management purposes, we have about 15 minutes left. How long is your presentation?
I'm going to go real fast,
So
5 minutes max.
very good. Okay, thank you.
Maybe not even. So hello again, Sam Souls.
That's good.
I'm going to build off of Shadi's presentation and try to not duplicate, be additive, and use same vocabulary. Just as a reminder on roles, Kathleen mentioned that the project sponsor is really that piece. What I'm going to be bringing to you today is to think about long-term when you are sitting there operating, what does your life as an operator look like? What are your problems look like on the facility? What does your leakage look like? What is that customer experience? I also want to say that you've heard Kathleen say a number of times, standing on the shoulders of giants. And in the staff report, I included a metric. So if you think about 50 express lane facilities nationwide, 9 are open access with just skip stripe. And hybrid skip stripe, as Shadi mentioned, the double white stripe, which is around safety zones, not really for any kind of barrier to entry for another reason. 7 of those 9 are in the Bay Area. So you're really talking Bay Area and Washington is really the open access, and it's driven by those right-of-way constraints. And we are seeing how that plays out in a few different ways. So open access, if we look at these slides, are presented from the idea that we're going to use closed access as that baseline, as the usual case for how express lanes are done. And so what you're going to see here is not a compare and contrast. It's just going to be a comparison against that as the baseline, that you have different types of violations now. You have the actual toll violation, you have the weaving, and then you have the evasion that's really, having to go chase violations. But now you also have these occupancy misdeclarations, which we are seeing a pervasive issue with in the current technology. There are other technology solutions that can solve that problem, so that's not directly related to open closed access. So as far as traffic operations, open access, you have more people that are able to get into the lane. So you have more trips that can be taken. You have more entry and exits that can be used for people to get on, cut over to the express lane, and get off. So if you think about the origins and destinations and how many trips there are in an open access facility, you have more people able to use it because more types of trips can be taken. It's more difficult to manage demand because our algorithms only take in data and spit out data so quick, and your price can't go from 50 cents to $8. It has to tick up. So if you think about that demand management, being able to answer to fluctuations, it actually works out pretty smoothly, so it's not that intense, but it is something that makes predictability for users a lot harder. With closed access, the one I want to point out is that one of the biggest reasons that agencies look at closed access is that ability to meet that 45-mile-an-hour requirement. The whole premise of express lanes is based on that being able to be the standard of performance. And open access can compromise that based on data that we're seeing. Open access also impacts revenue. All those different types of violations, the being able to chase those post-transaction, being able to know whether or not your price is really representative of the demand. Those are all factors that start coming in to erode your ability to really manage revenue and predict it. I would also say that when it comes to being able to understand whether or not you're priced appropriately with cheaters in the lanes, it's really difficult to know like what the actual value of your lanes is and being able to deliver that reliable trip for that cost to drivers. And lastly, on revenue, when you think about the types of violations, and this is one that I just was talking to a board about, that I should make the differentiation now. When we process a toll violation, that toll and that penalty comes back to the operating authority. If you process an HOV violation or a dangerous weave merge violation, that money doesn't usually come back to the toll operator's books. So just keep that in mind that when we say violations and the penalties that come with that, those start taking two different revenue streams. And then, of course, the driver experience, as I said, it opens the facility to be able to have more people use it. But it also carries that risk that Shadi covered and that I've already touched on. So I'll move this along. Constructability. When you limit access, you literally have fewer equipment locations to put down. And when you think about the capital costs, as well as the operational and maintenance costs of very large gantries, poles, comms, power, open access multiplies that. So if you think of a bridge that has one toll point and all that stuff is right there to maintain, that's a lot cheaper to build and it's a lot cheaper to maintain than spreading out 20 read points down a corridor to be able to capture vehicles as they go down the corridor and then package all that data together to build a trip. Signing is definitely an important element that's going to have to be considered. This is really the only way you can communicate with users on the road. We found in focus groups in the Bay Area recently that a lot of the reason that lower income households, as well as market rate households, don't use the express lanes is because they don't know how. And to your point, Director, Chair, as far as the ability to have people understand policy and to get that good front-loaded piece, easy policies that are easy to communicate really do net out better performance with customers being able to understand how to use your facility and know that they're being a good customer and using it right. On the roadway, that's signage. And I mentioned the toll points being a lot more infrastructure. So when we think about things being all else being equal, more trips means more usage, which means more leakage. And so if you think about closed access, fewer trips, more reliable trips, less trips by people who may want to be in a lane that doesn't work for their trip. They can't get all the way over and use that lane within the access point. Chair, did you have a question? Do you want me to stop?
No, go ahead and finish, and then I just had a comment on that.
Okay. So when we think about those things, being able to really get that lane performance and that reliability for customers, closed access can do that. Open access offers more trips to more people. And that's kind of the juxtaposition if you treat everything else as equal. So our understanding with the roles, as we've mentioned twice already, that CARTA staff recommend that YOLO TD and Caltrans consider an express lane configuration that has so soft barrier, double striped line without any kind of pylons or channelizers on the causeway. And then outside of the causeway, at least a 2-foot buffer with pylons or channelizers, and even wider up to 4 feet if the right of way allows. This also comes with, as YOLO TD and Caltrans make these considerations, that our assumption is that the traffic and revenue that understands what kind of trips are being made in that corridor, as well as any kind of traffic engineering work that would need to be done would be part and parcel of this consideration.
All right.
Was that 5 minutes? Did I get it?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, we have one more item, so I wanted to make sure we had the opportunity to ask questions or make comments on the presentation. Are there any initial thoughts, comments on what's been presented? Retro, left? Nope.
And just, Mr. Chair, as you guys kick off board discussion, staff are happy to defer item 8 to next month's meeting to
Okay,
give
we'll
more
see how
time
it goes.
today.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Steph.
I have less discussion, but more, I sit on YTD, so Yule Transportation. I'm the chair this year, actually. And it would be helpful to know just from my colleagues here, if you do have thoughts on this as we're going back and carrying that to YTD so that we can make sure that we are considering everyone here. And so I'm going to be quiet outside of that.
If I could, Chair,
Yes, sir.
I just offer one thing and I don't want to challenge it, but there was the presentation of a number of, an assumed potential leakage of 10 to 15%. I think we know in California that in high occupancy vehicle lanes alone, that violation is 30 to 50%. And that's somebody trying to gain a time advantage. They're not even trying to not pay something. If you look at studies published in the Bay Area or things like that on some of these open access express lanes, they're seeing violations in excess of 30%. Now, again, it's not CARTA's revenue, but I'm speaking to YOLO TD who, and we've already heard public comment, and there's lots of designs on what we call net excess revenue. So I just think it's important. I mean, that decision is one that over a 30-year life cycle of a project is not tens of millions, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars of unrecognized gross revenue. And it's also, as it's already been spoken to by Sam, you know, it's a lot more of those $2.50 operational transactions than those 20 cents transactions. So when they say drag on revenue, that's sort of the numeric sort of, you know, the numbers surrounding that quote unquote drag on revenue. It's a very big decision.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation. I appreciate it. Just a few comments I'd like to make is, I think the presentation started talking about the Bay Area and it got mentioned. A lot of the systems in the Bay Area are open access, right? And there is leakage there. And part of the reason is, and we're here for this situation, is the constraint we have. So I want to make sure that we all understand that shoulders are really important. Driver expectation for striping and sticking to our standards is important. I'll just give you a little piece of information on that. If you go to Southern California, the first time I ever drove, I want to say State Route 91, it's an express lane. You'll see they got those vertical pylons and they were beat up. And I had staff, just because I was curious how much we replaced those. On any given bottom line, every 2 to 3 years, every single one of those pylons gets replaced because they get hit eventually. That's how often these things get hit. And that's assuming you have the space. If you don't have the space, that can become a safety issue, an operations issue, and you can end up having major concerns with that. I do believe strongly we need to look at additional detection points where we probably don't have them right now. That is definitely an area that we at Caltrans are going to be leaning forward aggressively on, because we believe without the, shall we say, the right of way, the width that we need there to be able to implement some of these recommendations in a safe manner, that would be the other, you know, the other way that we can try to minimize cheaters from getting in and out and not being detected. And after a while, you catch them long enough and say, you know what, I'm not going to try. So those are the things that we can definitely look into. And the last thing I'll say is, if we do, again, controlled access with these pylons, there is just normal, I think I may have mentioned, normal history on this where you do have the access points, because obviously you eventually have to have them to be able to get out and in. There's a concentration of accidents. So that, because everybody knows, hey, this is, I got to get in now, or I got to get out now. And there's a concentration of accidents. So my point being is, while the revenue discussion is a very important one, there's a strong safety component to all of these. And I love the way this was framed. There are trade-offs, and we're analyzing all these things, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to jeopardize safety.
Yeah,
that's all I have. Thank you.
Well said. Is there, I mean, what kind of modeling are we going to be, or is it available for us to look at any of the modeling in terms of what the corridor currently looks like? Because there's a lot of questions in my head around access for folks that live proximity to it, trying to get north and south, who aren't taking the long trips. I know we're focused, I think, largely on that commuter pathway, but the reality is, with limitations on the roadway, something's got to give. And so if we are with a limited pathway focusing on commuter, which I think is an agreement here, the short commuters are going to have to figure out how to get and avoid the accidents that you're talking about, but yet still have access to the freeway that runs through the middle of their town. So the modeling would probably be helpful to understand how we are making these decisions around all the things that have been posed thus far with some data.
Sure. So Caltrans has, of course, done a bunch of this analysis as part of the environmental document for the project. So I'm happy to work with District 3 and get that in a summarized, digestible manner for y'all to process and put that on a receive and file for a future board item. But I think what we got to keep in mind is, unlike a lot of the other toll lanes we might end up with in our region, this one has a 4-mile segment in the middle that's a bridge that no one gets in and out or goes anywhere, which is the place where we also have no gantries. So we're dealing with a really specialized case where there's nowhere for it. You're on the causeway for that 4 miles. And if we have no gantries on that 4 miles and it's just a solid white stripe, right? That's sort of the conflict we're dealing with
Fair
here.
enough. Thank you. Yep. All right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just quick questions, just so I'm clear. So I think you had mentioned that the April was kind of this timeline that we were looking at for this discussion. So two piece, one is, can you just clarify that I know it's coming to CARTA because we're operating this. The final decision that's made on barrier, no barrier, what type of barrier, all that is with partnership with Caltrans and YTD, or is it Caltrans decision alone with feedback from YTD in this board?
A spicy question.
It is.
CARTA perceives YOLO TD and Caltrans as co-project sponsors from CARTA's perspective. So CARTA's perspective is that it is up to the project sponsors together.
Right.
I think the two agencies probably could each make their own case as to whose jurisdiction it is. I don't see, at least at the staff level.
We're gonna get
Perfect. There you
along,
go.
right?
Great. Thanks, Autumn.
Come on, Sergio.
Save me.
We're saying we're
I
gonna
want
get
to see what
along.
I
I know, Sergio and I were making eye contact about this. So, my understanding, the way that we have an agreement as the recipient of the infra grant, we have certain ability to inform Caltrans decisions with regard to the final design of the project. But ultimately, Caltrans as the owner operator of the roadway has the final decision. Does that sound right, Sergio?
100%, and thank you, Autumn, for that. And look, I'll just state the obvious. At the end of the day, all of the features that are out there have to be stamped by an engineer to attest to the standards and the safety of the facility. We are open to suggestions. We're open to see how we can minimize leakage, how we can do all these things. But like I said, sticking to those engineering standards to protect the safety of that facility and really the integrity of our plan documents is an area that we just can't deviate from. So at the end of the day, we will be sticking to those standards if that's what we have to do. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. No,
Yeah.
I just wanted, so I guess I'm curious to know kind of where, if the decision point is April, right? And if YTD is gonna take this up and have this conversation, is that, we've heard some questions and some requests from this board of more information, what modeling, what that looks like. Is that gonna come back here in March for us to have a better understanding from from the CARTA board that can then inform YTD and have the conversation with Sergio and his team? Or how do you see that playing out? Because it seems like there's a lot more up here in terms of questions and wanting information. And, as somebody said, this is a huge decision. And I would love to be able to have the tag or this board take this up again and actually have a more in-depth conversation around the impacts of it. I'm just curious as to what your timeline looks like.
Happy to take that direction to work with Caltrans and YOLO TD staff to understand their timeline a bit better and see what we can do to get this brought back to CARTA for more discussion. Please.
Yeah, I would like to make just a clarification. More than glad to bring information back. Everybody gets informed, no question about it. But at the end of the day, if we have to make a decision and we've exhausted all options and we've worked with all your teams through the technical committees, and we're able to share as to why we ended up with a certain decision, we can share that with all of you. And then at that point, we can see, what we're missing. And if we're missing something, more than glad to make adjustments, but otherwise then we can just move forward.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll just one last thing, and I'll happy. I mean, just, and with all due respect,
Yeah.
right? I mean, when things happen and things kind of, if things happen, they go sideways, whatever, this, we're at this board, but elected officials and folks at YT are going to be bearing the brunt of that blowback from the community or from users. And so I think for us to be able to have, with you on this board and the voting scene, all this like a collaboration conversation where, and I'm not implying it's not, but where this input, this feedback, and I understand safety standards and what the engineer has to do, but I really hope that we can have a certain level of trust and collaboration that we are trying to move forward in a way of where folks really want to see this land.
Okay.
Okay. Final comment, Director.
Thank you so much. Really interesting conversation. I just really look forward to learning more. Just want you to know that public safety is front, mind, and center for me. So as we move forward, that's what I'm going to be looking at as a board member.
So there we go. Some more to come. Any final thoughts or comments on this item? We are going to defer item 8 to next time.
I just want to say, maybe it's obvious to all of you, but the last discussion is exactly why we created this authority with the different participants, right, and representatives alongside Caltrans. You're the only toll authority with Caltrans sitting there as a voting member. So well, more to come, but I'm glad to actually have you have that discussion and ask for more.
Very good. Okay. All right, very good. Okay, so that's the end of our
And
formal
for the record,
agenda.
Director Villegas, there's no public comment on this item, so.
Thank you for that, Robert. Very good. Now it's official. All right, so with that, there are no other matters that I see coming forward. Otherwise, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.